The courtroom was silent, except for the soft murmurs of people whispering to each other. Everyone had their eyes on the judge, who had just picked up the case file. His glasses rested on the tip of his nose, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. Then, his eyes stopped on the name of the man standing before him. The judge's hands froze. His breath hitched. He looked up, his gaze locking onto the old man in handcuffs. The moment their eyes met, the judge's face crumpled. His lips quivered, and suddenly, tears streamed down his face. The entire courtroom gasped. No one had ever seen a judge cry like this before. The bailiff stepped forward. "Your Honor, is everything all right?" The judge ignored him. He kept staring at the old man, his face full of pain, regret, and something else, something deeper. Slowly, he stood up from his seat. His voice came out in a whisper, almost too soft for anyone to hear. "Sergeant, is that you?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The old man in handcuffs lifted his head. His tired, wrinkled face twitched as he recognized the judge's voice. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the judge took a step forward. Everyone held their breath. And then, 3 days earlier, the old man had no idea that his entire life was about to change. It was a cold, windy afternoon when he trudged down the sidewalk, his cane tapping against the pavement. His name was Richard Dawson, a 75-year-old war veteran who had seen more battles than he cared to remember. Life had not been kind to Richard after the war. Once, he had been a strong, fearless soldier. Now, he was just an old man, struggling to make ends meet. His pension was barely enough to cover rent, and his small apartment was falling apart. Some days, he went without food just to save money. But today was special. Today, he had somewhere important to be. As he walked past the shops and diners, he tightened his grip on the small bouquet of flowers in his hands. They weren't fresh, but they were all he could afford. He checked his pocket to make sure he still had the small gift wrapped in brown paper. It was a simple pendant, a tiny silver heart with the name Lily engraved on it. His daughter. It had been years since he last saw her. After the war, he had lost everything: his home, his wife, and worst of all, his relationship with Lily. She had been only a little girl when he was deployed. When he came back, he wasn't the same man. The nightmares, the anger, the pain, it had pushed her away. But today he was going to fix it. He had finally found her address. He was going to see his daughter again. The bus stop was just across the street. The light was red, but there were no cars in sight. The road was completely empty. He hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the street, eager to catch the bus. A loud honk ripped through the air. Richard barely had time to turn his head before the black SUV came speeding towards him. Everything happened so fast. Tires screeched. People screamed. And then, bam! The world spun. Pain exploded in his side as his body slammed against the pavement. His cane flew out of his hand. The flowers scattered across the road. The gift for his daughter rolled away, lost in the chaos. Richard groaned, his body trembling from the impact. His vision blurred as people gathered around him. "Sir, sir, can you hear me?" a voice shouted. He blinked, trying to focus. A police officer was crouched beside him, looking concerned. The officer's radio crackled. "We need an ambulance. Elderly male, hit by a vehicle. Possible injuries." Richard tried to speak, but his chest hurt too much. Then, the officer's face hardened. "Wait a second. Did he just cross on a red light?" A murmur spread through the crowd. He did. He crossed when he wasn't supposed to. He broke the law. Richard's head throbbed. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell them that he had only crossed because the road was clear, that he hadn't seen the car coming, that he was just trying to catch the bus so he could see his daughter. But no one was listening. Moments later, another police car pulled up. A second officer stepped out, shaking his head. "All right, sir. I'm afraid I have to charge you with a traffic violation." Richard's heart sank. "Please," he croaked. "I was just—" The officer didn't let him finish. "You'll have to appear in court." Then, to his horror, the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around his wrists. Richard Dawson, a veteran who had once fought for his country, was now being arrested for crossing a red light. People in the crowd whispered in shock. Some looked at him with pity, others with judgment. As they led him to the police car, he glanced back at the street. The flowers were crushed. The gift for his daughter was gone. And with that, the doors slammed shut behind him. Little did he know, His past was about to come rushing back in the most unexpected way. The police car's engine rumbled as it pulled away from the scene. Richard sat in the back, his hands cuffed in front of him, staring out the window. His body ached from the impact, but the pain in his chest wasn't from the accident. It was from something deeper. He had been so close to seeing his daughter again. Now, he was being taken to the police station like a criminal. The officer driving glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You got a record, old man?" Richard didn't respond. "Figured," the officer muttered. "Military guy, right? You got that look. Ain't the first time I've seen someone like you in cuffs." Richard clenched his jaw. He had been through worse than this. Years ago, he had dodged bullets, survived explosions, and watched his friends die in battle. Compared to that, sitting in the back of a police car should have been nothing. But somehow, this was different. This humiliation, this helplessness, it burned. The car came to a stop outside the police station. The officer got out, opened the door, and pulled Richard to his feet. The cold wind cut through his thin jacket as he shuffled forward. His joints screamed in protest, but he didn't complain. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Officers walked back and forth, filing paperwork, answering phones, and typing on computers. A few glanced at Richard as he was led through the station, their eyes filled with curiosity or indifference. The officer brought him to a desk where a young cop sat, chewing gum as he typed on a keyboard. "We got an old-timer here. Caught him jaywalking. Caused a whole mess." The young officer looked up, unimpressed. "That's it. A red light violation. He got hit by a car," the first officer added. "But get this, he was at fault." The young cop raised an eyebrow. "So we're booking him? Judge wants him in court. No exceptions." Richard sighed. This was a nightmare. The officers took his fingerprints, snapped his photo, and made him sit on a hard bench for what felt like hours. His legs were stiff, his back hurt, and his head pounded. He just wanted to go home. But where was home? His apartment was nothing but four walls and a bed. It wasn't a home. It was just a place where he existed. "Dawson!" A voice called his name, snapping him out of his thoughts. An officer stood in front of him, holding some papers. "You're being released until your court date. You have a week." Richard let out a slow breath. They handed him his belongings, his wallet, his cane, and a piece of paper with the court date printed in bold letters. He took it without a word. As he stepped out into the night, the cold air bit at his skin. The streets were mostly empty now. The world kept moving, uncaring, as if nothing had happened. He reached into his pocket, hoping to find the pendant for Lily. It wasn't there. His heart sank. Gone. It was gone. His hands clenched into fists. First, his chance to see his daughter had slipped away. Now, the only gift he had for her was lost too. He turned his face to the sky, exhaling. The night stretched above him, vast and endless. For a moment, he felt like he was back in the desert, under a different sky, with the sound of gunfire in the distance. But those days were long gone. Now, he was just an old man with nowhere to go. He tightened his grip on his cane and started walking. The streets blurred past him. The city had changed so much over the years. New buildings, new roads, new people. It was like he didn't belong here anymore. Eventually, he reached his apartment. He climbed the stairs slowly, his legs aching with each step. When he finally reached his door, he fumbled with the key, his fingers stiff from the cold. Inside, the room was just as he had left it, dim, quiet, and empty. He sat down on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. The court date was in 7 days. 7 days until he had to stand before a judge for something so small. He shook his head. Life was strange. For years, he had risked his life fighting for this country. And now, that same country was dragging him to court over a traffic violation. He let out a bitter chuckle. Maybe it was time to stop fighting. Maybe he should just accept that this was how things were now. But deep down, a part of him wasn't ready to give up. He still had to find Lily. And no matter what, he would make it to that courtroom. Because somehow, someway, this wasn't over yet. Then, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside. Richard's body tensed. His instincts kicked in immediately. He reached for the small pocket knife he kept under his pillow. His breath slowed, his heartbeat steadying as years of training came back to him. Another bang, closer this time. And then, the sound of footsteps. Someone was outside his door. And they weren't alone. Richard stayed completely still. His grip on the pocket knife tightened as his ears tuned into the sounds outside. Years of training had taught him to recognize threats before they struck. The shuffling footsteps, the hushed voices, whoever they were trying to stay quiet. But not quiet enough. Another sound. A soft click near the doorknob. Someone was trying to break in. His muscles tensed. His body may have aged, but his instincts hadn't. He had survived ambushes before. This was no different. Slowly, he moved toward the door, keeping his steps light. His hand hovered over the knob. He could hear two voices now, whispering, "Are you sure this is the right place?" "Yeah, man. Old dude, lives alone. Easy target." His jaw tightened. Robbers. Probably looking to take whatever little he had. He inhaled, steadied himself, then, bam! He yanked the door open and lunged. The two men outside weren't expecting it. The one holding a crowbar yelped in shock as Richard shoved him back, slamming him against the wall. The other, a skinny guy with a hoodie, staggered backward, reaching for something in his pocket. Richard didn't wait. He twisted the wrist of the man with the crowbar, forcing him to drop it. Then, with one swift movement, he kicked it away. The second man pulled out a knife, too slow. Richard grabbed his arm and twisted. The knife clattered to the floor. The man groaned in pain. "Who sent you?" Richard growled, his voice low and dangerous. "And no one, man. We swear. We just thought this place was empty." Lies. Richard's grip tightened. His pulse was steady. He had interrogated worse men than these. Then, sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the hallway window. Someone had called the cops. The robbers panicked. "Let us go, man. Please." Richard exhaled sharply, then shoved them both away. "Get out of my sight." They didn't hesitate. They scrambled down the hallway, disappearing into the stairwell just as the front doors of the apartment complex burst open. Seconds later, an officer appeared at the end of the hall, gun drawn. "Hands where we can see them." Richard sighed and raised his hands. "I live here," he said tiredly. "Those guys were trying to rob me." The officer lowered his gun slightly, but kept his eyes locked on him. Another officer joined, looking past him into the apartment. "No sign of forced entry," the second cop muttered. "Looks like he stopped them before they got in." The first cop stepped forward. "Sir, are you hurt?" Richard shook his head. "No." The officer studied him for a long moment. "You're the guy from earlier," he finally said. "The one from the accident." Richard didn't respond. The officer sighed. "All right. Since they didn't steal anything, we can't do much unless you want to press charges." Richard thought about it, then shook his head. "No point," he muttered. The officers exchanged glances, then nodded. "All right. We'll patrol the area in case they come back. Try to get some rest." Richard closed the door behind them and leaned against it. Rest. He had almost forgotten what that felt like. He moved back to his bed, sinking down with a tired groan. His body ached. His mind raced. First the accident, then the arrest. Now an attempted robbery. It felt like the world was testing him. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. He pulled the court paper from his pocket and stared at it. 7 days. 7 days until he had to face the judge. He didn't know it yet, but that courtroom was about to change everything. And the past he thought he had left behind was about to come knocking once again. Then, a knock on the door. Not the cops. Not the robbers. Someone else. And this time, it was someone who knew exactly who he was. Richard's breath slowed. The knock was soft but firm. It wasn't like the robbers' careless banging. Whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. His grip tightened around his cane as he pushed himself up from the bed. He had no idea who to expect. Another knock. He exhaled and unlocked the door. As it creaked open, his tired eyes met a familiar face, a face he hadn't seen in decades. A tall man stood in the dim hallway, dressed in a dark coat, his hair peppered with gray. His deep-set eyes held something between shock and guilt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the man's voice came, rough and hesitant. "Richard." The name came out like a question, like he still wasn't sure if the man in front of him was real. Richard blinked, his mind struggling to place the face. It had been so long. But then, like a ghost from the past, the memories came rushing back. His breath caught. "Daniel?" The man swallowed hard and gave a slow nod. "Captain Daniel Whitmore." Richard's old commanding officer. A man he once followed into battle. A man he once trusted with his life. A man who, many years ago, had vanished without a trace after their last mission together. The air between them grew heavy. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice quiet, wary. Daniel hesitated. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small. Richard's eyes widened. It was the pendant. The tiny silver heart with Lily engraved on it. His breath hitched. I found this at the scene of your accident, Daniel said. Figured it belonged to you. Richard's fingers trembled as he reached out and took it. The weight of the tiny object in his palm felt heavier than anything he had carried in years. He clenched his fist around it. How did you know where I live? Daniel sighed, shifting uncomfortably. I asked around. His gaze softened. I had to see you. Richard's grip on the pendant tightened. A lifetime ago, he would have been happy to see his old captain. But now, his eyes darkened. You disappeared, Richard said, his voice sharp. After everything we went through. You just left. Daniel exhaled slowly. I had my reasons. Richard let out a bitter chuckle. I bet you did. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel took a step forward. Can I come in? Richard hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he stepped aside. Daniel entered, glancing around the tiny apartment. It was bare, worn down, just like the man standing in it. Not much, huh? Daniel muttered. Richard scoffed. Didn't need much. Daniel sat down at the small table by the window, rubbing his hands together. I heard about the court case. Richard leaned against the wall. So what? You here to laugh at me? Daniel looked up sharply. No, I'm here to help you. Richard's jaw clenched. I don't need help. Daniel shook his head. Yes, you do. And whether you like it or not, I owe you. Richard narrowed his eyes. Owe me? For what? Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze lowered to the floor. Then, softly, he said, for what happened in Basra. Richard stiffened. A wave of cold washed over him. Basra. The last mission they had together. The mission that went terribly wrong. His stomach twisted. He hadn't thought about that day in years, had tried to bury it deep inside. But now, Daniel had brought it back. Richard swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. Why now? Daniel looked up, his expression unreadable. Because I think what happened back then is the reason you're standing trial now. Richard's blood ran cold. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, a loud knock interrupted them. Not gentle, not careful. This was a demand. Daniel's face darkened instantly. Were you expecting someone? Richard shook his head. The knock came again, harder this time. Richard and Daniel exchanged a look. Something wasn't right. Daniel stood up slowly, his body tense. Stay behind me. Richard's hand moved to his cane, where he had hidden his old combat knife inside the hollowed-out wood. He gripped it tightly. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, the doorknob turned. Whoever was on the other side wasn't waiting for permission. Richard's pulse quickened. As the door swung open, both men braced themselves. And then, a gun was pointed straight at Richard's face. Time slowed. The muzzle of the gun gleamed under the dim light, steady in the hands of a man dressed in dark clothing. His face was partially covered by a hood, but Richard could see his cold, calculating eyes. Another man stood behind him, also armed. Richard's instincts kicked in immediately. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before. His mind ran through options, searching for a way out. Daniel, standing beside him, remained just as still, his hands loose at his sides, his body coiled like a spring. The man with the gun stepped forward. Sit down, he ordered, his voice deep, controlled. Richard didn't move. Who sent you? The man's lip twitched. I said sit down. Richard and Daniel exchanged a quick glance. Then, in the blink of an eye, Daniel moved. Faster than Richard thought possible, Daniel lunged forward, knocking the gun aside. A shot rang out, shattering a lamp in the corner. Richard reacted instantly. He swung his cane, striking the second man across the knee. The man yelped in pain and stumbled backward. Daniel tackled the first attacker, forcing him against the wall. The man struggled, but Daniel's grip was iron strong. The second man recovered quickly. He raised his gun. Richard threw his cane. It hit the man's wrist, making him jerk, just enough for the bullet to miss. It shattered the window instead, sending glass raining down onto the floor. Daniel took advantage of the distraction. He twisted the first man's arm and yanked the gun away. With one swift motion, he slammed the man's head into the wall. The attacker collapsed like a rag doll. The second man saw his partner fall and panicked. He turned to run. Bam! Daniel fired a warning shot into the floor. Don't move. The man froze, his hands trembling. Silence. Richard, his breathing heavy, retrieved his cane. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The years hadn't taken everything from him. Daniel pressed the gun against the second man's chest. "Who sent you?" The man hesitated. Then, gritting his teeth, he said, "You know who." Daniel's jaw tightened. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Say it." The man swallowed hard. "It's about Basra." Richard felt his stomach drop. Daniel cursed under his breath. "So it's true." Richard turned to him. "You knew this was coming?" Daniel hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded. Richard clenched his fists. "What the hell is going on, Daniel?" The second man let out a low chuckle. "You have no idea, do you?" Before Richard or Daniel could react, the man lunged forward. Daniel tried to fire, but the man knocked the gun aside and bolted for the door. Richard reached for him, but he was too quick. The man disappeared into the hallway, his footsteps fading fast. Daniel cursed again. "Damn it." Richard turned to the unconscious man on the floor. "What do we do with this one?" Daniel stared at the fallen attacker, then exhaled sharply. "We need to leave." Richard frowned. "What?" Daniel met his eyes. "They're not done coming for you." Richard took a step forward, his voice low. "Tell me the truth, Daniel. Why are they after me?" Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that made Richard's blood run cold. "Because of what happened that night in Basra. You were never supposed to make it out alive." Richard's breath caught. The words hit him like a bullet. His mind raced back to that mission. The gunfire. The ambush. The moment everything went wrong. His heart pounded. "Start talking," Richard demanded. Daniel glanced at the unconscious man, then at the shattered window. "Not here," he muttered. "It's not safe." Richard clenched his jaw. His entire world had just shifted. He had spent years thinking the war was behind him. But now he realized something terrible. The war wasn't over. It had just followed him home. Richard grabbed his coat. He didn't have much, but whatever he left behind wouldn't matter if he didn't make it out of this alive. Daniel pulled the unconscious attacker to the side, making sure he wasn't a threat before motioning toward the door. "We need to move. Now." Richard didn't argue. His instincts screamed at him to trust his old captain, at least until he got some damn answers. They slipped out of the apartment and into the dimly lit hallway. The building was quiet, too quiet. Richard's sharp eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. The second man had escaped. There was no telling how soon backup would arrive. They took the stairs down, moving fast but careful. Richard's body ached, but adrenaline kept him steady. When they reached the ground floor, Daniel peered through the front window. "Black SUV parked across the street," he muttered. "Tinted windows." Richard followed his gaze. The vehicle sat there, engine running, waiting. "More of them?" Richard asked. Daniel's expression darkened. "Most likely." Richard exhaled through his nose. "So what's the plan?" Daniel pulled his hood over his head. "We go out the back." They moved quickly through the side hallways, avoiding the main entrance. Daniel led them to the rear exit, checking for movement. Clear. They slipped into the alleyway, the cold night air biting at their skin. Richard gripped his cane, feeling the hidden blade inside. Daniel led the way, sticking to the shadows, moving like a soldier still in the field. Richard followed, his body remembering old tactics. "Stay low. Stay quiet. Always watch your six." After several turns, they reached a parking lot behind an old diner. A few cars sat under flickering streetlights. Daniel pointed to an old sedan. "That one's mine." Richard raised an eyebrow. "This rust bucket." Daniel smirked. "They won't expect us in it." They climbed in, and Daniel started the engine. The car groaned, but came to life. As they pulled onto the road, Richard finally spoke. "Talk." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "What do you remember about our last mission?" Richard scoffed. "A lot of things. Mostly how everything went to hell." Daniel nodded. "That night in Basra. The ambush. The classified intel we were sent to recover." Richard's stomach tightened. "Yeah." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "What if I told you that mission wasn't supposed to be a success?" Richard turned to him sharply. "What?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "We weren't meant to make it out alive, Richard. We were sent into a trap." Richard felt his heartbeat slow. "No, that couldn't be true. We lost good men that night," Richard muttered. "I know." Daniel's voice was rough, filled with old guilt. "Because someone on our side made sure we wouldn't come back." Richard shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "What?" Daniel hesitated. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to Richard. Richard unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. The more he read, the colder he felt. It was an old military report. But there, buried in the details, was something that sent chills down his spine. His name, Richard Dawson, marked for disposal. His blood turned to ice. His hands shook. His voice cracked. This can't be real. Daniel's face was grim. I found this 6 months ago, buried in old classified files. Someone high up wanted you dead, Richard. And when the mission failed to kill you, they waited, Richard finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The accident. The court case. The attackers. It wasn't random. It was a delayed execution. Richard clenched his fists. Someone had been hunting him for years. His breath came slow, controlled. Who? Daniel hesitated. I don't have a name. But I have a lead. Richard turned to him. Where? Daniel's eyes flickered with something dark. A man named Marcus Vance. Former intelligence officer. He went off the grid years ago. But he's the only one who might have answers. Richard inhaled deeply. Where is he? Daniel didn't blink. He'll be at your court hearing. Richard's grip on the paper tightened. This wasn't about a red light violation anymore. This was a death sentence. And if Marcus Vance was there, then walking into that courtroom might be the last thing Richard ever did. The old sedan rattled down the empty road, its headlights barely piercing the darkness ahead. Richard stared at the crumpled document in his hands, his mind racing. Marked for disposal. The words burned into his brain. Someone had decided, years ago, that he wasn't supposed to survive. Someone had been watching him. And now, they were making their final move. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. You need to be ready, Richard. Whoever's behind this isn't just going to let you walk into that courtroom and leave alive. Richard exhaled slowly. I'm done running. Daniel glanced at him. That's exactly what they're counting on. Silence filled the car as they approached an old gas station on the outskirts of town. Daniel pulled in and killed the engine. The neon lights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. We need supplies, Daniel said. Weapons, burner phones, cash. Richard nodded. His hands ached, his body was tired, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The war wasn't over. It had just been waiting. Daniel led the way inside, moving with the same cautious energy he had back in their military days. The clerk, a teenager with headphones in, barely acknowledged them. Richard picked up a cheap burner phone while Daniel grabbed a map and a prepaid debit card. They paid in cash, keeping their heads low. As they stepped back outside, Richard turned to Daniel. Where are we going? Daniel unfolded the map and pointed to a small town a few miles away. Safe house. A guy I trust lives there. He can help us prep for the hearing. Richard smirked. You trust someone? Daniel gave a dry chuckle. Not many people. But this guy, he used to be one of us. Richard didn't ask questions. If there was one thing he had learned in life, it was that trust was rare. They got back into the car, and Daniel pulled onto the road. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, Richard said quietly, I should have died that night. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. We both should have. Richard clenched his jaw. Why let me live? Why wait all these years? Daniel sighed. I've been asking myself the same thing. Maybe you were supposed to disappear quietly. No one expected you to fight back. Richard scoffed. They don't know me very well, then. Daniel chuckled. No, they don't. The car rumbled down the road, the wind howling outside. Then, just as they passed a mile marker, headlights appeared behind them. Bright. Fast. Gaining. Richard stiffened. We got company. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. Hold on. The black SUV from earlier was back. And this time, it wasn't alone. Another set of headlights appeared, pulling up alongside them. Richard's pulse quickened. We're boxed in. Daniel muttered a curse. They were waiting for us to leave town. The SUV on their left swerved, slamming into their side. The old sedan jerked hard. The tires screeched. Richard gripped the dashboard. They're trying to run us off the road. Daniel gritted his teeth. Not happening. The second SUV sped up behind them, closing in fast. Richard's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and stuck in a beat-up car against two professional killers. Then, the first SUV jerked right. Bam! It slammed into them again. The sedan skidded violently, tires screeching against the pavement. Daniel fought the wheel. Hang on. Richard grabbed his cane, his body tense. Got any bright ideas? Daniel's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Yeah, one. Then, He yanked the wheel hard to the right. The sedan lurched toward the SUV beside them. The other driver wasn't expecting it. Metal slammed against metal. The SUV lost control for just a second, but a second was all they needed. Daniel swerved back, cutting across the highway. Now, he barked. Richard reached out, grabbed the door handle, and with one swift movement, he threw the door open. The sedan's door slammed into the SUV. The impact sent the other car spinning. Richard watched as it skidded off the road, smashing into a ditch. But the fight wasn't over. The second SUV behind them sped up. Daniel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. They're going for a pit maneuver. Richard knew what that meant. The second SUV was going to hit their back tires, spin them out, and end this fight permanently. "We're out of time," Richard muttered. Daniel nodded grimly. Then, gunfire. Bullets ripped through the back window. Glass shattered. Richard ducked as a bullet whizzed past his ear. Daniel jerked the wheel. The sedan veered off the highway. They hit the dirt road, bouncing, shaking. The second SUV followed. Richard gritted his teeth. "We need to stop them." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Hold on." Then, the bridge appeared. A narrow wooden bridge, barely wide enough for one car. Daniel's eyes flashed with an idea. He floored the gas. The sedan rocketed forward. The SUV behind them didn't slow down. They reached the bridge, tires skidding. Wood creaked beneath them as they raced across. Then, right as they reached the other side, Daniel yanked the wheel. The sedan spun. Richard barely had time to brace himself before the car skidded to a stop, blocking the bridge. The SUV was seconds away, too fast to stop. The driver realized too late. The vehicle hit the bridge's guardrail. The wooden beams snapped. And in one terrifying moment, the SUV flipped over the side. Richard watched as it tumbled down into the dark river below. Silence. Only the sound of rushing water remained. Richard exhaled, his body trembling. Daniel let out a slow breath. That was close. Richard turned to him, his heart still pounding. Yeah, too close. Daniel shifted the car into gear. "We need to move before more of them show up." Richard leaned back, staring out at the river. Whoever was behind this, they were serious. And if Marcus Vance was showing up at the court hearing, that meant the real fight hadn't even started yet. Richard gripped his cane. He was ready. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet once more. The danger they had just escaped felt like a distant memory, though Richard knew better than to let his guard down. The second SUV had gone into the river, but that didn't mean there weren't more waiting for them around the next corner. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. The moment they'd pulled away from the wreckage, he'd started driving at a pace that was much faster than what was safe on the winding country roads. Richard glanced over at him. "You all right?" Daniel gave a tight smile. "I've been through worse." Richard didn't doubt that for a second. The man had seen things in the field that no one should ever have to witness. He had a way of handling pressure that Richard couldn't help but admire, even if it was a bit too reckless for his tastes. They drove in silence for a while. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the occasional crackle from the radio. Richard's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what had just happened. How far did this go? Daniel had just pulled them out of a near-death situation, but he was only now starting to realize the weight of what he had said earlier. Richard had always thought his past was buried in the sands of time, forgotten by the world and long gone. But someone out there had made sure he never forgot. And now, they were hunting him down for something he wasn't even sure he'd done. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel slowed the car and turned down a narrow, unmarked road. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small, dilapidated building in the distance. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but Richard could see the faint glimmer of lights from inside. Daniel pulled the car up to the front of the building, and as they got out, Richard took a long look around. There were no other cars in sight, and the area was eerily quiet. "Is this your friend's place?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice low. "His name's Gavin. Used to be a signal specialist. Knows how to disappear when he needs to." He paused, his eyes scanning the area. "I trust him, but that doesn't mean we're safe here." Richard nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the pocket knife tucked in his waistband. They approached the building's front door, which was slightly ajar. Daniel knocked once, twice. A voice from inside answered, gruff and quiet. "I know it's you, Whitmore. Come on in." The door creaked open all the way, and they entered the small, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with dust, but it was warm, and the faint smell of something cooking lingered in the air. A tall man with scruffy hair and tired eyes looked up from a worn wooden table. Gavin, just as Daniel had described him, someone who had been living off the grid for years. He didn't stand when they entered, but gestured toward a pair of chairs. "Have a seat," Gavin said. His voice was gravelly, and he looked at them both as though he was used to seeing trouble walk through his door. Daniel sat first, but Richard hesitated for a moment before following. "Don't worry," Gavin said. "This place is off the radar. If anyone's looking for you, they won't find you here." "Good," Richard muttered. He had learned not to trust too many people, but for the moment, he was willing to give Gavin the benefit of the doubt. "What's going on, Whitmore?" Gavin asked, his eyes narrowing. Daniel glanced at Richard before responding. "You know what happened in Basra. You know what happened after. They've been hunting Richard for years. They finally caught up with him." Gavin's expression didn't change. "So the rumors were true." Richard stiffened. "What rumors?" Gavin met his eyes for the first time, and there was something cold in his gaze. There were whispers. Whispers about a covert operation that went sideways. About soldiers, veterans, who were targeted after they were no longer useful to the higher-ups. "That was you, wasn't it?" Richard's mind raced. He had never known the full extent of what had happened after that night in Basra. All he knew was that he had barely made it out alive, and the rest of his unit had been left behind. But now, Gavin was saying things Richard had never imagined. "They were trying to kill me?" Richard's voice cracked. Gavin nodded. "From what I heard, the whole operation was a setup. You and your team were expendable. No one was supposed to come back, but you did. And that's when they started cleaning up the mess." Richard's thoughts spun, and he gripped the edge of the table. "So why didn't they just kill me then?" Gavin leaned forward. "Because you were a loose end. They never expected you to survive. They thought the job was done." Daniel's voice was low, dark. "But now someone's making sure that loose end is tied up. And Richard's at the center of it all." Richard looked between them both. "Who's behind this, Gavin?" Gavin shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they've got resources. Money. Power. And they've been watching you, Richard. Every move you've made." He paused, glancing at Daniel. "They're not going to stop until you're out of the picture." Daniel stood up abruptly. "That's why we're going to find them first." Gavin's eyes flickered. "Are you sure about that? Taking the fight to them is dangerous. You're dealing with people who will kill anyone who gets in their way." Daniel looked back at him with steely determination. "I've been doing this my whole life. I'm not about to stop now. We need to find who's behind all this. And we need to find them fast." Gavin nodded slowly, as though considering his words. He stood up and moved to the corner of the room where a makeshift desk was set up. He dug through a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Here's what I have on Marcus Vance," he said, sliding the folder across the table to Richard. "It's not much, but it's a start." Richard opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. The name Marcus Vance appeared several times, along with references to covert military operations and classified missions that Richard had never been told about. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about exposure. And Richard Dawson was about to face the truth, no matter what it cost him. The folder was heavy in Richard's hands, but not because of the paper inside. It felt heavy because with every page he turned, more pieces of his past fell into place. Marcus Vance's name was everywhere, hidden between layers of top-secret operations, coded messages, and the kind of work Richard had once believed was for a different world. A world he had left behind. Richard's heart raced as he scanned the documents, the names of soldiers, operations, and cryptic notes that meant nothing to him. It was clear now, there was a much larger web of secrets wrapped around his life than he'd ever known. He slammed the folder shut. "Marcus Vance," Richard muttered under his breath. "He's the key, isn't he?" Daniel stood behind him, arms crossed. His voice was low. Vance was one of the top players in military intelligence. When he went off the grid, a lot of things stopped making sense. That's when the rumors about veterans getting targeted started. Gavin, still seated at the table, glanced at Richard. "Vance knows something about you, something only he can answer. But finding him is the trick." Richard's eyes narrowed. "How do you find someone who doesn't want to be found?" Gavin shrugged. "You don't. But I have a few contacts who might have a trail." "Might." Daniel leaned in, his gaze intense. "What do you need to make that happen?" Gavin raised an eyebrow. "Patience, for one. And resources." The kind of resources that cost money. Richard's chest tightened. We don't have time for that. They'll be after us long before you dig up anything useful. True, Gavin admitted. But without the right information, you're walking into the lion's den blind. Trust me, you don't want to do that. Richard clenched his jaw. The court hearing was only days away, and he had no choice but to go. Vance would be there, and if Gavin's information was right, Marcus held the answers to everything. The truth about Basra, why he had been marked for death, and who was pulling the strings behind it all. We need to move quickly, Richard said. I can't wait for months of investigation. Gavin thought for a moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he grabbed a set of keys from the table. There's a safe house a few miles from here. It's remote, off the grid. We can set up there and figure out our next steps. It'll give us time to track Vance. But we leave now. Daniel nodded. Let's go. Richard stood, his muscles aching from the tension that had been building in his body. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding the truth. And the only way to do that was to face Marcus Vance. The three of them piled into the car and left the safe house behind. The road ahead was dark, winding through the thick trees of the surrounding forest. Richard kept his eyes out the window, lost in thought. He could still hear the crash of the second SUV hitting the guardrail, still feel the rush of adrenaline from the fight earlier. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the court date, the hearing, and Marcus Vance. Do you ever wonder how we ended up here? Richard asked, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced at him, his expression unreadable. I've stopped wondering about a lot of things. Gavin chuckled softly. Welcome to the club. But Richard wasn't ready to stop wondering. He wasn't ready to let go of the past, not until he knew the truth. The car rolled to a stop in front of a nondescript cabin. There were no lights on, no signs of life. Just an empty building surrounded by trees. Gavin turned off the engine and handed Richard a small black device. This will block any surveillance, Gavin explained. We don't need anyone listening in while we talk. Richard nodded, taking the device from him. The air outside was cold, but the silence of the forest was comforting, almost peaceful. For a moment, it felt like they were a world away from the chaos. But Richard knew better than to let his guard down. Inside the cabin, the floor creaked as they entered. The only furniture was sparse, wooden tables, chairs, a single couch. It was simple, but it was safe. For now, we'll stay here for the night, Gavin said. Get some rest. I'll start making calls in the morning. Daniel nodded, but didn't sit down. I'm not sure any of us will get any rest until we know who's pulling the strings. Richard sat down on one of the chairs and exhaled, his mind racing with all the pieces that didn't fit. What had he missed all these years? How had he managed to survive so long, without even knowing who was behind it all? And what about Lily? He hadn't seen his daughter in so long. Would she even recognize him? Would she still want to see him? He couldn't let the past stay buried any longer. Richard stood up and moved to the small window, staring out at the darkness beyond. There were too many questions, and too little time to answer them all. Then, suddenly, the sound of a car engine. Richard's heart skipped a beat. A car was approaching, and this time, it wasn't a random drive-by. Someone had found them. Richard's hand instinctively went to his waistband, where he kept his pocket knife. His body tensed as he moved toward the window, his eyes squinting to see past the blackness. A car was coming down the long, gravel road leading to the cabin, its headlights piercing the night. He could hear the faint rumble of the engine as it got closer, each second making his pulse race faster. Daniel, who had been pacing around the cabin, stopped and locked eyes with Richard. We're not expecting anyone, are we? Richard shook his head, his fingers tightening around the knife. No, we're not. Gavin stood up from where he had been sitting near the table, his hand moving to the small handgun tucked into his belt. If they're here for us, we need to be ready. The car slowed as it neared the cabin. Richard moved quickly to the door, keeping himself low and out of sight. The headlights illuminated the edges of the cabin, casting long shadows on the trees around them. The car stopped just in front of the cabin, its engine idling. Richard's breath caught. He could hear the crunch of gravel as footsteps approached the door. There was no time to make a plan, no time to think. They were here. Gavin stepped quietly to the side of the door, his hand gripping the handle of his gun. Richard could feel the tension building in the air. Each second felt like an eternity. The door handle jiggled. Don't open it, Richard whispered. Daniel, his eyes cold and focused, nodded. He stood still, his hand resting near the knife at his waist, ready for anything. Then the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the faint light from the car. The person was tall, wearing a long coat, with a hat pulled low over their face. Richard's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped fully into the room. It was a woman. Her movements were calculated and graceful, the kind of precision Richard recognized from his own training. But this wasn't someone he had expected to see. "Gavin," the woman said in a low, familiar voice. "You should have known I'd find you." Gavin froze, his eyes narrowing. Elena. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Elena. She had been part of their unit in the past. He remembered her well. Sharp, tactical, and cold. She had been someone he trusted once, someone he had worked beside in operations that blurred the lines between the law and necessity. But then she had disappeared, just like Marcus Vance, just like so many others from their world. "I thought you were dead," Gavin said, his voice laced with disbelief. "We all thought you were dead." Elena took a step forward, and the dim light revealed her face. She looked different, older, harder, but the coldness in her eyes was the same. "Dead? You should know better than that, Gavin." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm never dead. I just disappear." Richard stepped forward cautiously, his hand still on his knife. "What do you want, Elena?" She turned to him, her gaze sharpening. "What I want," she repeated, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I want you to stop running, Richard." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I'm not running. I'm getting answers." Elena chuckled darkly. "Answers? That's what you think you're getting? You've been asking the wrong questions." She took a step closer. "You think this is about Basra? About some covert operation that went wrong? No, Richard, this is much bigger than that. Much, much bigger." Richard's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" Elena's expression became more serious. "You think Vance is the one pulling the strings? He's just a small part of a much larger picture. You're being played, Richard." "We all were." Gavin, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his hand still resting on the gun at his side. "What the hell are you saying, Elena? What's really going on?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She seemed to weigh her words carefully, almost as if she was choosing whether or not to reveal the truth. Then, with a sigh, she finally spoke. "There's a shadow organization. A group that has been operating for years. They pull the strings behind all the military operations, behind the intelligence work, and even behind the people who were supposed to be disposable. You, Richard, were never supposed to make it out of Basra alive. Neither was I. Neither were any of us." Richard's mind spun. "So what? This was all part of their plan." Elena nodded slowly. "You were just a pawn in their game. All of us were." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But the real question is why they let you live, Richard. Why you were chosen to survive when others weren't. I don't have that answer yet, but I'm going to find it." Richard's head throbbed. Everything he thought he knew was being turned upside down. The war, the missions, his life, everything had been a lie. He was no longer sure who the enemy really was. "And Vance?" Gavin asked, his voice tight. "Where does he fit into this?" Elena's eyes flicked to Richard. "Vance has the answers. He's the one who knows exactly what happened. And he's the one who can explain why you're still alive." She gave Richard a hard look. "If you want to survive, you need to find him. Because he's the key to all of this. But be warned, Richard. They're watching you. They're always watching." Richard's breath caught. He had been walking blindly into a trap all along. But now, Elena's words confirmed everything he had suspected. The pieces were starting to fall into place. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for something far bigger. "I don't trust you, Elena," Richard said firmly. "But I need to know what you know. And I need to find Vance before they find me." Elena's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then we're on the same side, Richard. For now." But Richard knew better than to trust anyone in this game. Elena might have been a part of his past, but now, in this tangled mess of lies and shadows, he didn't know who was friend or foe. Still, the clock was ticking. And with Marcus Vance at the center of it all, there was no more time to waste. The weight of Elena's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Richard stood motionless, processing the information that had just been thrown at him. The words shadow organization, and they've been watching you, echoed in his mind, each one making his pulse race. Elena was right about one thing. There were forces much bigger than he had ever imagined controlling things behind the scenes. But what was their ultimate goal? And why had they kept him alive for all these years? Gavin broke the silence first, his voice sharp. So what now, Elena? You're telling us this massive, secret organization is hunting us, and you expect us to just, what? Sit back and wait for answers. Elena looked back at him with an unreadable expression. No, I'm saying we find Vance. He's the only one who can help us piece everything together. And we have to be quick, or we won't get another shot at this. Richard moved toward the window again, peering through the blinds. The wind rustled the trees outside, but the silence of the forest was unsettling. How long did they have before more people showed up? How long before whoever was tracking them would catch up? Why Vance, though? Richard asked. His voice was steady, but underneath, there was a current of urgency. Why not just go after these people ourselves? If we're really on the same side, why don't we? Elena cut him off, her voice low and controlled. Because Vance is a key player. He's been in their circles longer than anyone else. He knows the structure, the leaders, the inner workings of this entire operation. You'll never find out what's really going on without him. Trust me. Richard nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It made sense. He couldn't keep chasing shadows and hoping to find the truth on his own. He needed to confront Vance, no matter how dangerous it was. Daniel had been silent until now. He stepped forward, his gaze focused and determined. Where is he? Elena didn't hesitate. I have a lead. But it's not going to be easy to get to him. He's not hiding in some cave or forgotten bunker. He's surrounded by people. He's got protection. If we want him, we have to get through all that. She turned toward Richard, her eyes narrowing. But you've been in worse situations, right? Richard's lips twitched. Yeah, worse. Gavin's hand clenched around the edge of the table, his voice tight. And how exactly do you plan to find him? We can't just march up to his doorstep and knock on the door. The moment we show our faces, we'll be dead. Elena met his gaze with an unsettling calm. We don't need to march up to his doorstep. We need to find someone who's been close to him. Someone he trusts. We'll start there. But we need to be quick. Richard frowned. Who's that? Elena smiled faintly. Someone you know well. Richard's breath hitched. He didn't like where this was going. Who? Elena's expression softened, but there was a cold edge beneath it. Your daughter. For a moment, the world seemed to go still. Richard's chest tightened, his heart racing. Lily, his daughter. How could she be involved in all of this? She had been just a little girl when he was deployed. They had barely spoken since then. You're saying Lily knows Vance. Richard's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Elena nodded, her gaze never leaving him. She's been part of the operation for a while. She's a valuable asset to them now, an insider. But she doesn't know who she's working for. Not fully. Richard's head spun. He felt like the room was closing in on him. Lily, his daughter, the one thing he had been trying to protect for all these years, was now a part of this nightmare. How is this even possible? Richard muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I don't even know where she is. How could she be involved? Elena's voice softened just a little. She's been under their radar for years. They've kept her close, kept her in the dark, while using her for their own gain. But she's a wild card. She might be the one person who can get us to Vance. She looked at Richard with something like sympathy. You need to find her, Richard. The only way to stop this is to get to her before they do. Richard's mind was reeling, but something deep within him hardened. His daughter was in the middle of this twisted game, and there was no way he would let her be used as a pawn. No way he'd let her be dragged into the chaos he had barely escaped. He clenched his jaw and nodded. We find Lily. We get to her before anyone else does. Then we find Vance. Daniel moved toward the door, a grim look on his face. And we're running out of time. Elena gave him a sharp nod. Yes. So we need to go now. Richard's hand tightened on the door handle. It felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on him now. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for Lily's future. The world was a darker place than he'd ever realized, and his daughter was stuck in the heart of it. They had no time to lose. The night air was colder now, and Richard could feel the weight of every step as they moved toward the car. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. There were too many pieces in motion, too many unknowns. But one thing was certain. If Marcus Vance was involved, if Lily was really part of this, then everything Richard had ever known was about to change forever. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what that meant. The drive to find Lily felt like the longest journey of Richard's life. Every minute counted, and with every mile they drove, He wondered how much longer he could keep his composure. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The road stretched ahead, the headlights of their car cutting through the dark forest as they drove toward a future Richard could barely comprehend. His mind was tangled in knots. His daughter, Marcus Vance, the Shadow Organization, and the growing realization that his entire life had been a lie. He had always thought that by surviving, he had won. But now he saw that surviving was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. Elena, Daniel, and Gavin were silent as they drove, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm ready to break. Richard couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into a trap. His gut told him they were, but his heart, the one part of him that still felt something, told him they had no choice but to keep moving forward. He needed to find Lily. He needed to find Vance. And he needed to end this, for good. After what felt like hours, they reached a small, nondescript building at the edge of a rundown neighborhood. The place looked abandoned, but there was something about it that set Richard's nerves on edge. He could feel eyes on them, even though the street was empty. "This is it," Elena said quietly, breaking the silence. They parked the car a few yards away and approached the building cautiously. There were no lights, no movement, just the eerie quiet of a place that had been left to rot. Richard's heart pounded as they approached the front door. Elena knocked 3 times, then waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 50s, disheveled, with a look of surprise in his eyes when he saw Elena. He was tall, thin, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Elena," he said, his voice hushed but urgent. "I wasn't expecting you." "Who are they?" Elena stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "They're with me. We need information." The man hesitated, but when he saw the determination in her eyes, he stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. Richard took one last glance at the empty street before stepping inside, where a dim light illuminated the room. There were files scattered across the table, some marked with red ink, others barely legible. The man, who introduced himself as Aaron, took a seat at the table and nodded for them to do the same. "What do you know about Lily?" Richard asked, his voice rough with urgency. Aaron took a deep breath and looked at the group with a serious expression. "Lily is working for them now. She's been recruited for a special operation. They've got her under their thumb. She doesn't know who's pulling the strings." Richard clenched his fists. "How can she not know? She's my daughter. She's been in this for years." Aaron raised a hand to cut him off. "It's not that simple. They've been keeping her close, feeding her lies, making her believe she's helping. But she's only a tool to them. She doesn't know the full picture." Richard's breath caught in his chest. His mind raced with the thought of his daughter, trapped in the same dark world he had been trying to escape. "How do we get to her?" Daniel asked. Aaron leaned forward, his eyes darting between the group. "You can't just walk in there. But you can reach her. There's a contact inside, someone she trusts, someone who can get her out." He handed Richard a small slip of paper. "This is the address. But be careful. They'll be watching. They know you're coming." Richard took the paper, his eyes scanning the address written on it. It was a safe house, hidden away, buried deep in the city. Lily would be there. And now, it was his only chance to save her. "We move now," Richard said, his voice full of resolve. They stood up and quickly made their way out of the house, moving with purpose, knowing time was running out. Every step felt like a countdown, as though the clock had been ticking against them from the moment Richard had been marked for death. As they neared the car, the world seemed to stand still for a moment. Richard's hand gripped the door handle, his mind racing. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, whether Lily would even be there, whether they could get to her before it was too late. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let her be taken by this twisted game. He got into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the empty streets, headed toward whatever lay ahead. And then, as they neared their destination, something caught Richard's eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows. His instincts flared. "Get down," he shouted. But it was too late. A flash of gunfire lit up the night. Richard woke to a world of pain. He could feel the coldness of the pavement against his skin, his head throbbing. His vision was blurry, but he could make out figures moving around him. Someone was speaking, but the words were muffled. He tried to lift his head, but his body wouldn't obey. He managed to force his eyes open, and what he saw made his heart sink. Lily. She stood there, her eyes wide, her face pale. But there was something different in her expression, something distant. She looked at him, her lips trembling. But instead of running to him, instead of reaching out to her father, she took a step back. No, no, this can't be happening, Richard whispered, his voice ragged. The world around him swirled, fading in and out. He reached toward her, but his body felt heavy, like lead. And then, as his vision blurred for the last time, he saw her turn away. The darkness consumed him. Epilogue. The trial came. But Richard Dawson never made it. The organization had won. They had played their cards, taken their piece, and in the end, his own daughter had been the one to seal his fate. But the game wasn't over. The world had just learned that one man's survival was never enough to defeat a shadow. The real fight was only just beginning.